Yes.
Welcome, everyone, to our tribute to John Lewis, to the bridge and beyond. The use of the word bridge is particularly meaningful to tonight's tribute, not only because it recalls John Lewis's role in the 1965 Voting Rights March across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, but because a bridge is at the very core of tonight's tribute. For example, let's consider the three co-hosts of tonight's webinar. First, Southwest Jewish Congress. Bridging with others in the community is the very purpose of this organization, and as stated in its mission statement. Blues, its organization's name being a combination of the first two letters, BL, of the Black community, and the final three letters, EWS, of the Jewish community, itself defines the object of this organization, to form a bridge between the Jewish and African American communities in recognition of our shared goals. And finally, Brotherhood of Temple Shalom. Can anyone deny that the successful crossing of any bridge requires shalom, peace, at every step of the way? Our three guest speakers will now lead us across that bridge. And in a moment, I will invite Dr. Barry Lackman to introduce our first speaker, Reverend Peter Johnson, who will tell us just who John Lewis was. But first, please make certain your audio speakers are muted. Please note we're trying to avoid barking dogs during the tribute. And also, please notice the buttons in the front panel, which you can use to direct questions to any of the speakers after their talk. We encourage you to do so. Thank you. Barry?
Thank you, Ken. It is my pleasure to introduce the Reverend Peter Johnson. Reverend Johnson is a living legend of the civil rights movement as a key member of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr.'s team and associate of John Lewis. Reverend Johnson is a native of Louisiana and attended Southern University. He has been a voice for equality and justice in Dallas for over 50 years. Since the four questions in the Passover Seder are a key component of the Jewish celebration of freedom from slavery, I will ask Reverend Johnson 4 questions related to John Lewis. Are you ready, Reverend Johnson?
Yeah, Barry, I'm ready, man. And looking forward to taking a few minutes talking about the boy from Troy.
So how did you meet John Lewis and what role did he play in your life?
I met John Lewis in 1963 as we began to plan the March on Washington, which would take place August 28, 1963. 1963, the summer of 1963 was an extremely active summer in the civil rights movement. Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, really all over the South. The activism and the protests began to spread all over the South. I became friends with John Lewis, Stokely Carmichael, Hewitt Brown, and James Farmer. In 1963, all of these men became very, very close to me. I was still in high school when I met John Lewis. John and Stokely and them old boys were already in college. I think John was 80 when he passed. I'm 75 now. So when I met John, I was still a high school student, and most of the fellows at SNCC at that time were already in college.
So what was special about John? Oh, here we go.
I just had him take that off my wall. That's John Lewis and C.T. Vivian receiving the presidential award from President Obama. John was low-key, quiet, dignified, and deeply, deeply committed to nonviolence.
So what was special about John Lewis that we should remember?
His determination. Selma is the hard evidence of how determined and stubborn John Lewis was. Of course, I preached about this the other day in terms of Dr. King's historical relationship to Selma, and how Dr. King was introduced to Selma when he was dating Coretta Scott, who would become Coretta King. In order for Dr. King to drive from Atlanta to Selma in Lowndes County, he had to go to where Coretta lived in Lowndes County. In order for him to drive from Atlanta to Coretta's home, he had to go through Selma, and he would be told, be careful going through Selma. So as a young man courting Coretta, he was introduced to Selma. So what took place on the Selma Bridge, Dr. King was in his pulpit preaching that Sunday because the students led by John Lewis and his stubbornness is the reason we have the right to vote today.
Tell us a bit about the connection of a few groups to the civil rights movement. How were Jews and other whites key to the civil rights movement? And any connections that you can bring us that relate to Dallas? And how was John Lewis connected to that role of the Jews and other whites in the civil rights movement?
Very good question, Barry. SNCC was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. It was the organization of students created by Ella Baker and Martin King and C.T. Vivian. The decision that students should have their own organization was made because the men who were men and with families and homes realized that you couldn't control the students. So the decision was, hey, the students, y'all ought to have your own organization. SNCC was made up of Black students, white students, and Jewish students. Those students created the foot soldiers of the civil rights movement. There was just as many Jewish students in SNCC as Black students in SNCC. Lest we forget that Andrew Goodman and James Chaney, Jewish kids from the East Coast, came to Mississippi, I think in 1964, the summer of 64, to do voter registration, something very, very radical, to register Negroes to vote. And of course, they lost their lives in Mississippi that summer, along with James Chaney, a Black student. Blood shed on Edmund Pettus Bridge was shed by Black people, white students, and Jewish students. The people I worked with personally throughout the civil rights movement were white kids and Jewish kids. One of the interesting things about Louisiana, when the first time I went to jail in Louisiana for protesting in Plaquemine, Louisiana, which is my hometown, a Jewish lawyer from California came to Louisiana to defend us and to help get us out of jail. Her name was Beverly Axelrod. Beverly was a dynamic, profound civil rights lawyer who came to work with us in the South and to help get us out of jail in 1963. The local newspaper in my hometown refused to admit that Beverly and the white kids from California and New York were white. They called them light-skinned people from the North. So the headlines in the newspaper in my hometown was, light-skinned troublemakers come to South Louisiana to participate in this mess. They just refused to admit that these were white people involved with Black people in the South in 1963. In addition to Beverly Axelrod, Bill Kunstler, Jack Ginsburg, Lynn Holt, all Jewish lawyers with a tremendous, tremendous history in the civil rights movement. I came to Dallas in 1969 after the death of Martin King. And a part of the reason was coming to Dallas was when Dr. King died, he didn't have no money, no life insurance. No life insurance company would sell life insurance to Martin King. So one of the challenges that the civil rights movement and SCLC was facing was how to secure financially Mrs. King and Martin's 4 little children. They were little bitty children at the time. Harry Belafonte, Sidney Poitier, and Samuel Livingston, a Jewish Hollywood producer, put together a documentary on Martin King's life entitled King Montgomery to Memphis. And the idea was we could take this documentary, it was going to premiere in 800 cities around the world, to raise money that Jewish investors was going to take and set up a trust fund for Mrs. King and the King family, so Mrs. King would not have to beg to raise her children and would be financially secure. So I came to Dallas to help organize the premiere showing of the movie King Montgomery to Memphis. And the movie was going to premiere in 800 cities around the world. 799 cities around the world welcomed the movie on Martin Luther King's life. There was only one city on earth that said we refused to show that movie on that nigger communist, the city of Dallas. If Dallas had not fought against the premiere showing of the movie on King's life, I wouldn't be here today because my assignment was going to only be 6 months in Texas. And I was organizing the premiere showing in all of the Southwest. I had Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, and New Mexico. Those were the 5 states that I was organizing the showing, and didn't have any problems anywhere else in the Southwest other than Dallas, Texas. And of course, being the youngest man at that time on Martin King's staff, I was embarrassed not to fulfill my responsibility for the movie to be a success in all of my states. So I was determined to make sure the movie would be successful in Dallas with the help of Jordan Offsire, who I knew because Jordan had gone to jail in Albany, Georgia as a Jewish student. So Jordan was somebody I knew historically who was here at a temple. Chef Israel was the name of Jordan's temple when I came here. There was another Jewish rabbi who was very close to Dr. King, Levi Olam, who was at Temple Emmanuel. And a number of other Jewish men that I knew and Jewish families who had been involved with us in other parts of the South. So part of the people who helped me here was my friend, of course, Jordan Offsire, Levi Olam, and a number of other Jewish people who worked shoulder to shoulder with me to help me make sure that the movie would be successful in this part of the country, and it was a success. But I decided to stay in spite of Anne the Young fined me for staying, and Mrs. King made him hire me back because I wanted to help the Farrell Park homeowners whose home was being taken by this city to build a parking lot for the Dallas Cowboys at the Cotton Bowl at that time.
Well, that's quite a history. What is John Lewis is important too because of the legacy of John Lewis. What legacy would John Lewis want us to carry on?
Well, for John Lewis, his tremendous contribution to American democracy is the Voting Rights Bill. If we want to pay tribute to John's legacy, vote. Help register more people to vote. It is John Lewis shed blood for the right to vote. I came here in 1969. When I came here, everybody was elected at large. There was a small Negro population registered to vote. Starting in 1970, every spring in either late April or early May, John Lewis and Julian Bond would fly to Dallas. We would have either a breakfast or a luncheon with them. They would bring me a check, and I would use that money to hire students from Bishop College and hire African American kids who was graduating from high school, seniors in high school, and hire them to work June, July, and August in Black communities registering people to vote. John and Julian, we would set up voter registration training schools here in Dallas and Black churches in South Dallas and in West Dallas, train students who was at Bishop College at the time and seniors finishing high school. We would teach them how to go door to door, convince Negro citizens to register to vote and help those citizens register to vote. Those funds came from Rodney Rockefeller, but it came through something John and Julian had created called VEP, Voter Education Project. And every spring of the year, they would fly here, bring me a big check, and we would hire 25, 30 students to work in the Negro precincts, registering Black people to vote and teaching people how to vote and organize and get out the vote campaigns. So John Lewis's contribution to Dallas is all of the Negroes that elected, that's Black people that's elected to office today. Say thank you, John Lewis. Say thank you, John Lewis and Julian Bond and Rodney Rockefeller.
So how would John Lewis want us to carry that legacy of voting on?
John talked about something he called good trouble. Standing up against injustice, oppression, and fighting against the suffering of our people to create a better life for the next generation. Here again, the best thing we can do to pay tribute to the legacy of this great man, the boy from Troy, is to register people to vote and make sure this 2020 election for president, we come out in large numbers and vote. Let's take the United States Senate back. And in the state of Texas, let's change Austin in terms of the Texas legislature. The best way to pay tribute to my friend John Lewis is simple. Let's vote. Let's vote in large numbers. Let's walk to the polls, Blacks, browns, whites, Jews, aliens that's here from all over the world. Register and vote, and that's the best way to pay tribute to John Lewis.
Thank you, and thank you for joining us tonight, Reverend Johnson. Later in this session, those listening will have an opportunity to ask you questions. But next, we will hear from Nelda Golden. Nelda?
Thank you very much. I am absolutely thrilled to be with you this evening on this very important program. It's thrilling to hear all that we're hearing, and to be able to participate means a great deal to myself. I am thrilled that the responsibility I have this evening is to share the essay that John wrote just before he died. And I am sharing that with Yolanda Gills, who was very active in blues. We will divide the remarks in two parts, and I will stop talking and Yolanda will start. In the meantime, let us listen carefully to what this remarkable man said. And his death happened. He knew it was going to, and the essay was read at his funeral. Let me start. Mr. Lewis wrote, "While my time here has come to an end, I want you to know that in the last days and hours of my life, you inspired me. You filled me with hope about the next chapter of the great American story when you use your power to make a difference in our society. Millions of people, motivated simply by human compassion, laid down the burdens of division. Around the country and the world, you set aside race, class, age, language, and nationality to demand respect for human dignity. That is why I had to visit Black Lives Matter in Plaza in Washington, though I was admitted to the hospital the following day. I just had to see and feel it for myself that after many years of silent witness, the truth is still marching on. Emmett Till was my George Floyd. He was my Rayshard Brooks, Sandra Bland, and Breonna Taylor. He was 14 when he was killed, and I was only 15 years old at that time. I will never, ever forget the moment when it became so clear that he could easily have been me. In those days, fear constrained us like an imaginary prison, and troubling thoughts of potential brutality committed for no understandable reason were the bars. Though I was surrounded by two loving parents, plenty of brothers, sisters, and cousins, their love could not protect me from the unholy oppression waiting just outside that family circle. Unchecked, unrestrained violence and government-sanctioned terror had the power to turn a simple stroll to the store for some Skittles or an innocent morning jog down a lonesome country road into a nightmare. If we are to survive as one unified nation, we must discover what is readily takes root in our hearts that could rob Mother Emanuel Church in South Carolina of her brightest and best, shoot unwittingly concert-goers in Las Vegas, and choke to death the hopes and dreams of a gifted violinist like Elijah McClain.
Like so many young people today, I was searching for a way out, or some might say a way in. And then I heard the voice of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on an old radio. He was talking about the philosophy and discipline of nonviolence. He said, we are all complicit when we tolerate injustice. He said, it is not enough to say it will get better by and by. He said, each of us has a moral obligation to stand up, and speak out. When you see something that is not right, you must say something. You must do something. Democracy is not a state. It is an act, and each generation must do its part to help build what we call the beloved community, a nation and world society at peace with itself. Ordinary people with extraordinary vision can redeem the soul of America by getting in what I call good trouble, necessary trouble. Voting and participating in the democratic process are key. The vote is the most powerful, nonviolent change agent you have in a democratic society. You must use it because it is not guaranteed. You can lose it. You must also study and learn the lessons of history because humanity has been involved in this soul-wrenching existential struggle for a very long time. People on every continent have stood in your shoes through decades and centuries before you. The truth does not change, and that is why the answers worked out long ago can help you find solutions to the challenges of our time. Continue to build union between movements stretching across the globe, because we must put away our willingness to profit from the exploitation of others. Though I may not be here with you, I urge you to answer the highest calling of your heart and stand up for what you truly believe. In my life, I have done all I can to demonstrate that the way of peace, the way of love and nonviolence is the more excellent way. Now it is your turn to let freedom ring. When historians pick up their pens to write the story of the 21st century, let them say that it was your generation who laid down the heavy burdens of hate at last, and that peace finally triumphed over violence, aggression, and war. So I say to you, walk with the wind, brothers and sisters, and let the spirit of peace and the power of everlasting love be your guide. In his own words, John Lewis challenged all of us, but particularly he challenged the young people. So I say to us all, let's go to work.
Good evening. My name is Ken Parker. I have the pleasure of introducing Professor David Patterson. David Patterson holds the Hillel Feinberg Distinguished Chair in Hollywood Studies at the Ackerman Center for Holocaust Studies at the University of Texas at Dallas. He is a commissioner on the Texas Holocaust Genocide Commission and has lectured at universities on all continents. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Patterson.
Thank you so much to everyone, and thank you to the Blues and the Jews and for organizing this very important memorial to John Lewis. I'm here to talk about bridges between Jews and African Americans. These bridges go back at least 200 years. We know that the story of the exodus of the Jews from slavery in Egypt was a powerful metaphor for the African Americans' long journey out of slavery from the South. When the NAACP was founded in 1909 by W.E.B. Du Bois and Ida B. Wells, Jews like Henry Moskowitz and Joel Spingarn were there with them. Spingarn was the NAACP's first chairman. And traditionally Black colleges provided a haven for Jewish professors who fled from Nazi Germany under the Third Reich, when other schools, the so-called good schools, right, would not take the German Jews in. And if you're interested, this is played out, this is documented in a very interesting film called From Swastika to Jim Crow. So going back more than 100 years, more than 150 years, we have this, this spiritual tie between Jews and African Americans emerging from slavery, emerging from oppression, responding to oppression. Now, when we speak of bridges, I'm here to talk about bridges between Jews and African Americans. When we speak of bridges in memory of John Lewis, the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama immediately comes to mind. On March 7th, 1965, what's known as Bloody Sunday, John Lewis crossed that bridge in an unimaginable act of courage. I mean, who of us could have set foot on the bridge? He crossed the bridge over into history, into humanity's history of a millennial testimony to the sanctity of every human being. What Martin Luther King called all God's children. Now, part of the bridge that we're talking about is memory. Memory is a bridge. Memory is a bridge that crosses over time. It crosses into the past for the sake of a better future. And so John Lewis himself, demonstrating this by his example, he crossed one bridge, he crossed other bridges afterward. He proceeded from the Edmund Pettus Bridge to stand with Ronald Reagan in 1987 to celebrate the liberation of Soviet Jewry. John Lewis understood the enslavement and the oppression of Soviet Jewry. In 2008, he sponsored a bill to memorialize Michael Schwimmer and Andrew Goodman, and James Chaney. Schwimmer, Goodman, and Chaney, who were murdered on June 1st, 1964, near Philadelphia, Mississippi. Philadelphia, right, the city of brotherly love. Here you have these two Jewish civil rights activists going to respond to the burning of an African-American church with James Chaney. They were taken and murdered on that day. In 1995, John Lewis, out of his humanity, his consciousness of brotherhood with humanity, with the Jews, John Lewis, he refused to be part of the Million Man March organized by Louis Farrakhan, a man known for his vicious anti-Semitism. John Lewis would not be affiliated with that, would not be associated with that anti-Semitism. Now, when we're building bridges, if we look to our memory, if we look to our history, one of the most enduring of all bridges is between African Americans and Jews is the word, the sacred word. That bridge is already there because the word is already there. It precedes us. It precedes us in our traditions, in our scriptures, in our prayers, in our memory. The bridge of the word between African Americans and Jews was very strong indeed. When John Lewis, Martin Luther King, and Abraham Joshua Heschel, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, marched in Selma, Alabama. This is the bridge of the scriptural word. What provided a bond between our peoples, and the rest of humanity, is a bond that affirms how each of us is tied to the other through God and through Adam. We share that scripture. We share that word. We share the teaching that tells us that God began with one and not two in order to teach us that no one can say to another, my side of the family is better than your side of the family. It's this word that binds us, that teaches us that there's only one side of the family. John Lewis understood this. Martin Luther King understood. Abraham Joshua Heschel understood this. There's only one side of the family. And to be a human being is to be a Ben Adam, a child of Adam. And so the African Americans have historically connected with Jewish teaching and tradition and made it part of their own tradition. And their spirituals, like Go Down Moses, Didn't My Lord Deliver Daniel? We are climbing Jacob's ladder. The famous speech of Martin Luther King, the mountain speech. The mountain speech. What's the mountain? What's the mountain in the mountain speech? It's Mount Nebo. It's the mountain that Moses climbed. And so we have African American churches named for this mountain, like the Mount Nebo Presbyterian Church, the Mount Nebo African Methodist Episcopal Church. There's Zion, the African American Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, the African Zion Baptist Church, the Mount Zion First Baptist. So these are bridges. These are bonds. So there's no opposing racism in our traditions that bind us, that bridge us. There's no affirming the holiness of the other human being without the word of the Holy. And I think our communities understand that. No one bears witness to that truth more profoundly than John Lewis, a man who has elevated the Jews in their own testimony, and who has made the word from our mutual traditions part of his own word. So I think it's part of his legacy. In the aftermath of his passing, we need to ask, where's the word now? Where is God now in our search to build bridges? I just have a couple of words to conclude. We're taught in Jewish tradition that Friday is a bridge between Sabbath and the other 6 days. On the Sabbath, we pray with our heart. On the other 6 days, we pray with our hands by reaching out to one another. And then we have a beautiful commentary on the story of Jacob when he crossed the river Yabok to reunite with his brother. And the commentary says that Jacob carried his children across the river. He took his children in his arms and carried them. So Jacob himself became a bridge. Jacob himself became a bridge. It's not that we should build bridges, we have to become bridges. So, and my last word is this. The Jewish tradition teaches that judgment takes place on a bridge, especially on the bridge that joins one human being to another. That's where we are judged for our humanity. For we have no humanity without one another. Red, yellow, black, and white, they're all precious in his sight, as Martin Luther King has said. And his friend, John Lewis, declared. We declare our humanity and the humanity of the other child of Adam, the other Ben Adam, the other child of Adam, not only by building bridges, but by becoming bridges to and for one another. And there, I think, lies the legacy of John Lewis. Thanks so much.
It is with great pleasure that I introduce our next speaker, Brenda Jackson. Brenda is the former Senior Vice President and Chief Customer Officer for Encore. She is a graduate of Prairie View A&M College and a graduate finance certificate from SMU. Throughout her career, she served on countless boards and civic community events. For example, for 5 years, she was on the regional panel to select finalists for the White House Fellowships and has been a board member of Southwest Jewish Congress over a period of many years. Her topic today, passing of the torch. Brenda?
Thank you, Nelda. Good evening, everyone. I am so honored to participate in this program this evening. The Honorable John Lewis, in his last essay, passed the torch to each of us. When we ask ourselves what we should do to honor his legacy, we are fortunate that he left us our marching orders in his own last words. The exact words you heard read to you this evening by Southwest Jewish Congress Program Vice President Nelda Golden and Blues member Yolanda Gills. Susan, could I have the first slide? And may I have the second slide? So what you see on the screen are the 10 specific actions that John Lewis left for us to do. He first cites the inspiration he felt from observing the millions of people worldwide who were motivated by the death of George Floyd to do something. The first step in honoring his legacy is to get inspired. For inspiration, some of you may have sought out African Americans and asked them what you should be doing. For many African Americans, the atmosphere following the death of George Floyd is decidedly different from what we saw following the deaths of many others like Botham Jean, Sandra Bland, and Breonna Taylor. So we're feeling renewed hope. Yet when people of other races ask us what they should do, the request stirs mixed emotions. African Americans want to give thoughtful, research-based answers, recognizing that one person does not know everything, nor speak for all Black people. One person does not represent all Black people, and no one wants to feel that they bear the responsibility for the inaction of people of other races that relied solely on them for direction about what they should be doing. Fortunately, the Honorable John Lewis left us an all-encompassing directive in his final essay. There are many directions a person might turn for inspiration. I recommend that you go to the internet and download your own copy of John Lewis's essay and keep it as a reference to measure your actions. Continue to participate in the programming offered by Blues and the Southwest Jewish Congress. Give some consideration to joining the Southern Poverty Law Center. All three organizations have missions that align with the legacy of the Honorable John Lewis and the blueprint he left us for moving forward. Turn to your faith traditions writings. Our traditions offer each of us ancient templates that lend themselves to modern interpretation. Those templates give us guidance and inspire us to action. May I have the next slide? The Honorable John Lewis admonishes us to use our own power to make a difference. It's what we're seeing from the leadership of various corporations in their public declarations of support for change. Here in Dallas, Encore CEO Alan Nye wrote a letter to his employees, and I'd like for you to listen to an excerpt of what he had to say. I spent the last few days reflecting on the heartbreaking and completely unacceptable tragedy in Minneapolis and the racial divide in our country and our state. In the past few weeks, there have been at least 3 separate incidents of lethal violence against African Americans, and we must recognize that these injustices are not isolated incidents. Rather, they're part of a larger pattern of racism. To our colleagues, friends, and families, I want you to know that our entire leadership team joins me in recognizing these injustices. We hurt and we stand with you. As a company, we're committed to fostering an environment of inclusion and respect. There is no place for racism, discrimination, or intolerance here. We choose to be a company that actively values diversity, not only in what we say, but also in what we do. May I have the next slide? The florist that I use is called Farm Girl, and the leader is a little casual. She offers herself to her customers as Christina. And she did quite a bit of writing on social media about the environment that we're in today. And she sent an email to her customers that said, for the month of June, we're proud to dedicate our With Heart campaign to the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, an organization that has worked tirelessly to secure political, educational, social, and economic equality of rights in order to eliminate race-based discrimination for over 10 years. So you must ask yourself, if you own a business and are responsible for hiring, is your workforce diverse? If not, you can change it. Are you responsible for purchasing goods and services? Are your suppliers diverse? If not, ask yourself why not and use your power to change that. The Honorable John Lewis further told us to set aside race, class, age, language, and nationality and demand respect for human dignity. He did not say it would be easy. It is, in fact, difficult and unpleasant and can lead to losing friends. For example, this action requires us to object when we hear jokes that are disparaging and to call out that behavior as behavior we will not tolerate. It requires us to stay alert to words that have the power to hurt others. May I have the next slide? Embracing the philosophy and discipline of nonviolence is a necessary element to keep the just nature of protest on people's minds. Could I have the next slide? Nonviolent protest engenders more respect for protesters, and this has been evident since Martin Luther King, John Lewis's mentor, taught the concepts of Gandhi to young Black students who were going to participate in lunch counter protest. John Lewis told us to honor our moral obligation to stand up, and speak out. And this goes hand in hand with getting into trouble, good trouble, necessary trouble. Perhaps you and your group decide to attend a city council briefing or a council meeting when a subject about an equitable and just society is on the agenda. And you decide to attend in big numbers. You might even appoint a spokesperson who signs up for microphone time, and you all stand while your spokesperson is speaking. The more often you do it, the less welcome you may become. Your presence may eventually lead to further speaker restrictions. You will then be in good trouble, having stood up, and spoken out. Many of you already participate in the democratic process, and you've heard each speaker talk about how important it is. John Lewis challenges us to take it to another level. Participation in the democratic process is not only about registering to vote and actually voting, it's also about campaigning for elected officials whose stated goals and prior actions are in line with your beliefs. It's about advocating for policy change you believe will result in a more equitable and just society. To honor the legacy of the Honorable John Lewis and remember the almost 9 minutes that George Floyd suffered, the Mayor of Washington, D.C. has committed to help 9 people get registered to vote and to help 9 people get to the polls during the upcoming election season. These are actions each of us and our organizations can easily commit to. May I have the next slide? When it comes to studying and learning the lessons of history, the resources are countless. The public broadcasting system has abundant programming that presents well-researched documentaries. As an example, there are 2 two-hour documentaries entitled Reconstruction, America After the Civil War, both researched and narrated by historian Henry Louis Gates. May I have the next slide? The New York Times Magazine's 1619 Project series was developed by the magazine to reframe American history around slavery and the contributions of African Americans. It was timed for the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the first enslaved Africans in the Virginia colony. While the 1619 project leader won a Pulitzer Prize for commentary, her conclusions are controversial. Opposing views are offered by the 1776 Project, which is an assembly of independent voices who uphold the founding virtues and values and challenge those who assert that America is forever defined by past failures and slavery. Both of these projects' findings can be had from the internet, and they're worthy of organizations organizing study groups to explore the concepts. May I have the next slide? A number of books currently on the market are particularly instructional and inspirational and fulfill John Lewis's order to study and learn the lessons of history. Isabel Wilkerson, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of The Warmth of Other Suns, examines the unspoken caste system that has shaped America and shows how our lives today are defined by a hierarchy of human divisions in her newly released book, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents. May I have the next slide? Ibrahim X. Kendi offers fresh perspectives in his best-selling How to Be an Anti-Racist. It has been said that the author's concept of anti-racism is transformative and reorients and re-energizes the conversation about racism and points us toward liberating new ways of thinking about ourselves and each other. May I have the next slide? I think this is the last slide, yes. And finally, the Honorable John Lewis reminds us that the most excellent way forward to a just society is through love, peace, and nonviolence. And now I invite you to welcome Southwest Jewish Congress President Susie Averney for questions and answers.
Thank you, Brenda, for that great message. You've given us ways to carry on the work of John Lewis, things that all of us can do. And thank you to Reverend Peter Johnson and to Dr. David Patterson for your presentations tonight. At this time, we'll have Q&A. So if you'll type your questions, I'll be able to get it and ask some of our questions to our panelists. The first one we have is actually for Nelda and Yolanda, who read the essay. And the question is, would you please tell us what emotions did you feel as you read the essay? And it's for Nelda first, and then Yolanda, please.
I felt very, very strongly that if there was so much meaning in what was said and how much he went through in his life and what he looked forward in the future. It was a very stirring message. And if you consider the fact that it was done in his great illness, he thought to the very end of his life in the project that he had set for himself.
Thank you. Now we'll go to Yolanda.
I thought in reading the speech and just going over it that it really was a call to action. I was moved by the essay and the 10 points that Brenda pointed out. It was a call to action for everybody, but particularly to young people. And history itself will tell the story of whether or not this is a real catalyst for a true change. I believe it is, but as John Lewis said in his essay, only history will be the judge of that. And so it inspired me to want to do more because of the essay itself.
Thank you. Reverend Johnson, this one is for you. Most of us have seen the movie Mississippi Burning, based on the deaths of the freedom riders or the civil rights activists, Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner. who were killed, Mississippi, I'd like to know what was the reaction for you and your fellow activists when this happened? And you lived it. You were living history at the time. What was it like to know that your lives were in danger every day? How did you go on?
As I stated earlier today regarding that summer in Mississippi and in other southern states, anybody who worked in the civil rights movement during that period in history who said he wasn't scared is lying. You were scared every day. I mean, every night you was worried that wherever you were spending the night or sleeping, the place may be bombed or shot in. Some places in Mississippi, people's homes it was too dangerous for us to stay in people's homes. They could lose their property. The bank would call a note on their homes. So we would spend the night riding the highways. One person drive, the other person stay up and make sure the person driving to go to sleep. Two people sleeping on the back seat, and every 4 hours you change around. So we spend the whole night in the car riding around because it was the safest thing to do. I don't have no good memories of that period. I didn't see Mississippi burning. That kind of stuff makes me cry, and I've shed enough tears for America. But my memories of those awful days, spending long, difficult days in filtered southern jails with roaches and rats. I don't have no good memories of that time at all.
That's right. You told us a little earlier as we were getting ready for this about the March on Washington in 1963 and why the kids led that. Why were the students leading that? Where were the men at that time?
Well, what had happened in Louisiana in 1963, I grew up in Plaquemine, Louisiana, and I grew up in the Plymouth Rock Baptist Church, what would become known in 1963 as the Freedom Rock Baptist Church. The church I grew up in was tear gas bombed 4 times. Well, we couldn't use the church anymore. Louisiana State policemen rode their horses in our church one night at a protest and trampled people under the hooves of horses in our church. August 28, 1963, the Big Six, 5 of them spoke at the March on Washington. James Farmer, who was the head of the Congress for Racial Equality, did not speak at the March on Washington because he was in jail in my hometown, along with the pastor of my church, along with the principal of my school. So the students had the responsibility of leading a part of the Louisiana delegation to the March on Washington and to the feet of Abraham Lincoln, because all of the men were in jail, and they voted to stay in jail as a protest. So Reverend Davis, my pastor, Bill Hollow, Mr. Hollow, the principal of our school, James Farmer, the head of CORE, all of these men voted to stay in jail as a protest during the March on Washington.
Wow, thank you.
Wow.
Brenda, this next question is for you.
Okay.
We'd like, in summary, what should we do today to follow the legacy of John Lewis?
To follow the legacy of John Lewis, you heard it from the Reverend Peter Johnson, and you heard it from Dr. Patterson, and John Lewis said it in his own words. We need to register, we need to vote, we need to help other people get registered and make sure they get to the polls. That is the single most important, those are the single most important things we can do right now to honor his legacy.
Thank you. And I'll follow up with that to say that there are many churches and synagogues here in Dallas. And also there's an entity called the Dallas Area Interfaith. And I'm sure there's other organizations which are going to be letting it be known that they will help people get registered. They will be organizing ways, carpools to get people to the polls. And I urge our listeners tonight to look out for notices about this so that we can all carry forth the legacy of John Lewis and get people to the polls. I would like for Reverend Johnson, if you would talk about good trouble in your own words, please.
Well, let's talk about good trouble in the context of America today and Black America and Jewish America. One of the things that, if you knew John Lewis, you admire was his tremendous courage. In today's challenge that Black people face today, there's a growing undercurrent hatred on the internet from Black youth toward Jewish Americans. We need to have enough courage to stand up. I did not go to the Million Man's March. I didn't know John Lewis took that stand until I just heard it. I didn't go because of the ongoing kind of hatred and bigotry toward my Jewish brothers and sisters. You know, the people who I went to jail with, hell, I'd probably still be in jail in Louisiana if not for Beverly Axelrod and Bill Consular and Walter Reuther, who raised the money to defend us. So good trouble today is for Black leaders, Black church leaders, Black civic leaders, not to be silent on what we see and what we hear regarding this growing kind of overt hatred toward Jewish people coming out of Black America and another generation of Black youth.
Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you. So I want to tell everyone that we are recording tonight, and we will upload to YouTube, and we will send the information out about how to find the recording to everyone who registered. You should get an email from us about that. So we want to thank our panel for presenting this program to us tonight. We thank the Blues, the North Texas Blues Coalition, and Southwest Jewish Congress. And we hope that everybody got a lot of meaning out of tonight's program. And thank you for joining us tonight, and your contact information should be up there in front of you for the organizations.
Sarah Valenti.
So thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Lewis, Reverend Johnson, Reverend Lewis and Reverend Johnson.
John Lewis is probably looking down saying, Peter didn't cuss at all. That is unusual.
No, Reverend Johnson, it was an honor for me to be on the same program with you. I'm humbled by it, and I'm profoundly in your debt for your wisdom, your testimony, and your teaching. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and God bless you, man. I'm honored to be here with you. And Brenda Jackson, it's good to see you again, baby.
Thank you, Reverend Johnson.
Thank you for joining us. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.
Night.
Good night, all. You did good, Pete.
Good night.
Yeah, good.
Thank you, Reverend Lewis, Reverend Johnson, Reverend Lewis and Reverend Johnson.
John Lewis is probably looking down saying, Peter didn't cuss at all. That is unusual.
No, Reverend Johnson, it was an honor for me to be on the same program with you. I'm humbled by it, and I'm profoundly in your debt for your wisdom, your testimony, and your teaching. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and God bless you, man. I'm honored to be here with you. And Brenda Jackson, it's good to see you again, baby.
Thank you, Reverend Johnson.
Thank you for joining us. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.
Night.
Good night, all. You did good, Pete.
Good night.
Yeah, good.